a dazzling Hollywood gala, all eyes were locked on Keanu Reeves as he made his way down the red carpet until chaos broke loose. A desperate young girl slipped past security, ran straight to him, and clung to his leg, her voice shaking as she pleaded for help. What she revealed in that moment made Keanu act instantly, shutting down the entire event on the spot. Before we dive into this shocking turn of events, drop a comment letting us know where you're watching from, and if you love stories like this, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. The majestic plaza gleamed with opulence, its towering glass doors reflecting the golden hues of the setting sun. Inside, the air buzzed with the energy of Hollywood's elite. Keanu Reeves entered through the VIP entrance, adjusting his cufflinks, a subtle gesture to shake off the unease of being the center of attention yet again. The grand lobby was a spectacle in itself, crystal chandeliers, polished marble floors, and staff moving with precision, guiding guests to their designated areas. As Keanu scanned the room, he caught glimpses of familiar and unfamiliar faces. Polite nods and hushed whispers followed him as he chose to take the grand staircase rather than the crowded elevator. Each step, cushioned with plush carpet, carried him higher into the heart of the event. At the top, a staff member, poised with practiced elegance, opened a set of frosted glass doors, revealing the lavish VIP lounge beyond. The room was a perfect blend of classic Hollywood glamour and modern extravagance. Soft jazz hummed in the background, glasses clinked in hushed conversations, and the air was thick with the scent of expensive perfumes and gourmet hors d'oeuvres. Despite years of navigating the world of fame, Keanu still felt like an outsider looking in. That brief hesitation was interrupted by a warm voice. "Good evening, Mr. Reeves. May I offer you a drink? We have champagne, whiskey, and a signature cocktail inspired by tonight's theme." Keanu considered for a moment. "Whiskey's fine, thanks," he replied with a small, appreciative smile. The server handed him a crystal tumbler, and Keanu took a slow sip, letting the warmth settle. Finding a quieter corner, he eased into a velvet armchair, observing the room with quiet detachment. Across the lounge, a renowned director animatedly recounted a story. A billionaire whispered to a supermodel, their conversation lost in the hum of the evening. Keanu was about to signal for another drink when a sudden shift in the room's energy caught his attention. Near the entrance, a disturbance rippled through the crowd. Guests parted, whispers rising, eyes widening. A figure emerged, moving purposefully through the sea of luxury and exclusivity. Keanu watched with quiet curiosity as a sharply dressed man strode in, his confidence radiating authority. But it wasn't just him. Trailing slightly behind was a young girl, her wide eyes darting around the opulent space, a mix of awe and nervousness in her expression. The man approached Keanu's secluded corner, his hand already extended in greeting. "Keanu Reeves," he said with a practiced charm, "Victor Langham. A pleasure to finally meet you." Keanu stood, shaking his hand firmly. "Nice to meet you, Victor," he replied, his tone warm but guarded. "And thanks for the invitation. This event is something else." "My pleasure." Victor's grin widened as he turned slightly, resting a hand on the young girl's shoulder. "This is my daughter, Sophie. She's been absolutely dying to meet you." Sophie, dressed in a denim jacket and jeans, hesitated. She looked up at Keanu, her big eyes sparkling under the lights, her voice trembling as she tried to speak. And in the next moment, everything changed. When Sophie finally whispered, "You're Keanu Reeves," his expression softened. He crouched down to her eye level, offering a gentle smile and extending his hand. "That's me," he said warmly. "And you are?" "I'm Sophie," she replied, her small hand disappearing into his as they shook. "I've seen all your movies. You're my favorite actor." Keanu chuckled, the warmth in her voice touching him. "Well, thank you, Sophie. That's very kind of you to say. Do you have a favorite movie?" Before she could answer, Victor's hand tightened slightly on her shoulder. Now, sweetheart, let's not bother Mr. Reeves with too many questions. I'm sure he's very busy tonight," he said with a polished smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Keanu glanced up, noting the slight tension in Victor's expression. "It's no bother at all," he assured them. "I always enjoy meeting fans, especially enthusiastic ones like Sophie." Victor's smile widened, but something about it felt forced. "That's very gracious of you. Perhaps we could get a quick photo for Sophie's memory book?" "Of course," Keanu nodded, standing up. "I'd be happy to." As Victor pulled out his phone, Keanu noticed Sophie's excitement dim just a little, her eyes flickering with hesitation. He placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder, offering a small, encouraging smile. "All right, everyone say action," Victor called out, snapping a few pictures. Then, as if reading from a script, he smoothly suggested, "How about a short video for social media? Just a quick hello from the three of us, if you don't mind, Keanu." Keanu agreed, and they recorded a brief clip, mostly Victor doing the talking while Keanu and Sophie waved at the camera. The moment the phone lowered, Victor's hand found Sophie's shoulder again, this time with a firm squeeze. "All right, sweetheart, time for you to go," he said, his tone suddenly clipped, his grip subtly guiding her away. Sophie's earlier excitement had fully faded now, her nod obedient yet subdued. Keanu caught the shift instantly, watching as she followed her father with small, reluctant steps. "Well, we should let you get back to your evening, Mr. Reeves," Victor said, his tone signaling the end of the conversation. "Perhaps we'll chat more later." "Definitely," Keanu replied, though his eyes were focused on Sophie. She cast him one last fleeting glance. Gone was the bright-eyed excitement from before, replaced by something quieter, almost disappointed. Dutifully, she followed Victor, her denim jacket shifting slightly as she stumbled to match his brisk pace. Keanu exhaled slowly, turning back toward the rows of auction displays. Under the golden glow of the chandeliers, rare collectibles and luxury items sat behind pristine glass, an autographed vintage guitar, a shimmering diamond necklace, a framed script from a Hollywood classic. He let his gaze wander, trying to shake off the unease creeping into his gut. And then, he heard it. A hushed but unmistakably sharp voice near the exit. "You happy now?" Victor's tone was low, tight with barely restrained irritation. Keanu's attention snapped toward the sound, his eyes catching a narrow gap in the door. Through it, he saw Victor gripping Sophie's arm. Her small frame recoiled slightly as he gave her a swift push forward. The door swung just enough for Keanu to see Victor handing her off to a staff member in a tailored uniform. The staffer's hands gently settled on Sophie's shoulders before leading her down a dimly lit corridor, away from the lounge. Keanu's jaw tightened. Something wasn't right. He stepped toward Victor, who was straightening his jacket, his polished demeanor snapping back into place as if nothing had happened. "Everything all right?" Keanu asked, his voice calm but threaded with quiet concern. Victor turned to him with a practiced smile, effortlessly composed. "Oh, everything's fine," he said smoothly. "Just time for Sophie to head to the kids' area now. She needs to have dinner with the other children, it's getting late, and the event starts soon." He flashed a grin that didn't quite touch his eyes. "You know how it is with kids at these things, always got to keep them on schedule." Keanu steadied him, instincts kicking in. There was something off, but Victor's expression remained unreadable. Before he could press further, Victor clapped him lightly on the shoulder. "If you'll excuse me, I need to greet some newly arrived guests." And just like that, he was gone. Moving effortlessly across the room, shaking hands, exchanging pleasantries, every bit the charming host. Keanu remained still, his gaze lingering on the door Sophie had disappeared through. The polished glamour of the gala suddenly felt thinner, like a stage backdrop barely concealing something darker. The golden glow of chandeliers and the hum of effortless conversation couldn't mask the unease gnawing at the edges of the night. Left alone, Keanu tried to push the feeling aside. He turned back to the auction display, letting his fingers trace the glass case of a signed film reel, but his mind wasn't there. Something about Victor. Something about Sophie. Keanu kept his posture relaxed, but as he casually moved from one display to the next, his ears stayed tuned to the room, listening. Victor's voice carried effortlessly through the space, smooth, confident, dripping with charm. But Keanu had heard another version of it just minutes ago, and he wasn't about to ignore it. Between fear and relief, her wide eyes darting down the hallway as if she were expecting someone to appear behind her at any moment. "Sophie?" Keanu said gently, stepping back to give her space. She hesitated, shifting on her feet, clutching the sleeves of her denim jacket. I was just looking for the restroom," she mumbled, but there was something off about the way she said it, like she was saying what she thought she was supposed to say, not what she really meant. Keanu glanced down the hallway, empty except for the faint murmur of the gala behind them. His instincts flared again. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice calm, but probing just enough. Sophie bit her lip, glancing over her shoulder, then back at him. I don't know," she admitted in a whisper. "I think I made my dad mad." Keanu crouched slightly to her level, keeping his expression open and reassuring. "Did something happen?" Sophie shifted again, clearly torn between speaking up and staying silent. She stole another glance down the hallway, her breathing quickening. Then, just as Keanu was about to ask another question, hurried footsteps echoed behind them. "Sophie!" Victor's voice, smooth yet laced with something sharper, carried down the corridor before he even came into view. The second Sophie heard it, she tensed, taking a half step back, her hands gripping the cuffs of her jacket. Keanu stood up just as Victor rounded the corner, his perfectly crafted gala persona still in place, polished suit, effortless smile, but his eyes flickered with something less controlled when they landed on Sophie. "There you are, sweetheart," Victor said, tone light but clipped. "I've been looking for you everywhere." Sophie swallowed hard, her gaze dropping to the floor. Keanu didn't move, his stance casual yet deliberate, positioning himself ever so slightly between Sophie and her father. "She was just heading to the restroom," he said evenly, his eyes locked on Victor's. Victor's smile didn't waver, but the temperature in the hallway seemed to drop a degree. "Of course. I was just worried, big event, lots of people. You understand." Keanu held his gaze, measuring every subtle shift in Victor's expression. "It's easy to get turned around in places like this," he said nonchalantly. "Sophie, do you still need to find the restroom?" Sophie looked up at Keanu, a flicker of something grateful in her eyes. She hesitated before nodding. Victor exhaled through his nose, a flicker of impatience barely noticeable before his mask of charm was back in place. "No need, sweetheart. Come on, let's get you back to the lounge. The main event's about to start." Sophie hesitated again, and Keanu didn't miss the way her fingers clenched around her sleeves. His jaw tightened. Something was definitely wrong. "Actually," Keanu said, his voice calm but firm, "I don't mind showing her where it is. You've got a whole event to run, I'll make sure she gets back safely." For the first time, Victor's smile faltered, just slightly. His eyes flicked to Keanu's, assessing, calculating. Then, after a beat, he let out a quiet chuckle, shaking his head as if amused. "No need to trouble yourself, Keanu. I appreciate the gesture, but she's my daughter, I'll take care of her." The way he said it, the unspoken emphasis on my daughter, was a quiet challenge. Keanu's muscles tensed. Sophie's breath hitched. And for a split second, the air between them held a dangerous, unspoken weight. Keanu shut off the faucet, his senses sharpening as he focused on the muffled conversation beyond the restroom door. The voices were low, urgent, one of them unmistakably Victor's. "Can't keep running off like that. You're making a scene." A softer voice, Sophie's, responded, but he couldn't quite make out the words. Then, Victor again, sharper this time. "Enough. You know the rules." A chill ran down Keanu's spine. He reached for a paper towel, using the motion as cover while he edged closer to the door, straining to hear more. The shuffle of feet. A rustle of fabric. A strained exhale. Then, a different voice, female, crisp, authoritative. "Victor, not here." Keanu's brow furrowed. Another presence in the mix. He risked a glance, cracking the door just enough to see into the hallway. Victor stood rigid, his hand still gripping Sophie's arm, though looser than before. Beside him, a woman, tall, poised, with dark, calculating eyes. She wore an elegant gown, her hair swept into a flawless updo. Sophie's mother? Take her upstairs, the woman said quietly but firmly. We'll discuss this later. Sophie shrank at her words. Victor let out a slow breath through his nose before releasing his grip. Fine, he said, his voice barely masking his irritation. Then, looking down at Sophie, he added, don't embarrass me again. Sophie didn't respond. Keanu's fists clenched. He pushed open the door fully now, stepping into the hallway with deliberate ease, as if he'd just casually stumbled upon them. Everything all right? His voice was even, light, but there was an unmistakable weight behind it. Victor's expression flickered, just for a second, before he turned on that perfectly curated smile. Ah, Mr. Reeves, he said smoothly, stepping slightly in front of Sophie as if to block her from view. Just a little family matter. Nothing to worry about. Keanu's gaze flickered to Sophie, then back to Victor. She seemed pretty upset earlier, he said casually, but there was an unmistakable edge to his words. Figured I'd check in. Victor let out a short chuckle, shaking his head as if amused. You're very kind, Keanu. But as I said, family matters. The woman beside him studied Keanu with quiet scrutiny before finally speaking. Sophie needs to get some rest, she said smoothly. It's been a long night. Sophie's fingers twitched at her sides. Keanu exhaled slowly, reading between the lines. He could push this further, but he knew Victor was already on edge. And right now, he had no leverage. No proof. Just a gut feeling that something was deeply, deeply wrong. So instead, he nodded, stepping back just enough to ease the tension. Of course, he said, his voice deliberately neutral. Good to see you both again. Victor gave a satisfied nod, then placed a firm hand on Sophie's back, guiding her down the hall. The woman followed, her expression unreadable. Keanu watched them go, every instinct in his body screaming at him. This wasn't over. Area. Keanu nodded, but his mind was elsewhere. Victor was outside, away from the crowd, away from the carefully curated spectacle of the gala. And Sophie had disappeared. His jaw tightened. As he followed the other guests toward the red carpet, Keanu's gaze swept the room one last time. If Barbara Langham was here, she was staying out of sight. If Sophie was still inside, she wasn't anywhere he could see. Something wasn't adding up. Jacob leaned in, lowering his voice as they walked. You've got that look, man. What's going on? Keanu hesitated, debating how much to say. Jacob was a friend, but he also had deep industry ties. If Victor had as much influence as people claimed, bringing this up to the wrong person could make things worse. Still, Jacob had a sharp eye. He'd already noticed Victor's bad mood. Just keeping an eye on something, Keanu finally murmured. Jacob studied him for a second before nodding. Well, if you need backup, you know where to find me. They stepped outside, greeted by a flurry of flashing lights, excited fans, and journalists calling out questions. The moment was surreal, a stark contrast to the tension still thrumming in Keanu's veins. He smiled and nodded as cameras snapped, moving through the familiar motions of the red carpet. Then, just as he was about to turn toward the entrance, a sharp movement in the crowd caught his eye. Near the far edge of the velvet ropes, where security was thinner, a small figure pushed through the press of bodies, small, frantic, unmistakably Sophie. She was trying to get to him. Keanu's stomach dropped. Her eyes met his, wide with desperation. Then, just as she reached the ropes, an arm grabbed her, yanking her backward into the crowd. Victor. Keanu didn't think. He moved. Sophie shrank back, clutching tightly onto Keanu's arm, her entire body trembling. She shook her head furiously, her eyes pleading. No. I don't want to go. Keanu felt her grip tighten, and that was all he needed. Victor's expression darkened just for a second, a flicker of frustration breaking through his carefully controlled mask. Then he let out a forced chuckle, shaking his head. "Come on now, Sophie. We've talked about this. You can't keep running off and causing scenes like this." He turned to Keanu, his voice lowering. "Mr. Reeves, I appreciate your concern, but this is a private family matter. I'd appreciate it if you didn't interfere." Keanu didn't move. His stance remained firm, protective. He kept his voice calm, steady. "Sophie is terrified of you, Victor." He looked him dead in the eye. "That doesn't seem like a family matter to me." Victor's jaw tightened, and Keanu could see the barely restrained anger simmering beneath the surface. He was losing control of the situation, and he knew it. Before Victor could respond, another voice cut through the tension. "Mr. Langham." A woman in a security uniform stepped forward, flanked by two other event security personnel. She looked between Victor and Keanu, then down at Sophie. "We've received a report of a possible child welfare concern." Her tone was professional, but firm. "Mr. Reeves, could you please step aside?" Keanu didn't budge. "Sophie doesn't want to go with him." Victor let out a short, incredulous laugh. "This is ridiculous. She's my daughter." The security officer gave him a level stare. "Sir, with all due respect, this is now beyond your authority. We've already contacted local authorities, and they'll be here shortly to assess the situation." Victor's expression turned stormy, his polished demeanor cracking at the edges. "You have no right." The officer raised a hand. "Until law enforcement arrives, Sophie stays here." She looked past him at another staff member. "Take her to a secure room, somewhere quiet. Make sure she's safe." Victor turned to Keanu, his eyes filled with something cold and dangerous. "You have no idea what you're getting yourself into," he said, voice low, controlled. "Stay out of this, Reeves." Keanu's expression didn't waver. He met Victor's gaze with an unshaken calm, then looked down at Sophie, gently squeezing her hand. "You're safe now," he murmured. Victor clenched his jaw, his hands curling into fists at his sides. But with security standing firm and the weight of the situation pressing in, he knew he had lost control. He took a step back, straightened his suit, and forced another empty smile. "This is far from over," he muttered, then turned and walked off, disappearing into the event crowd. Keanu let out a slow breath, then looked down at Sophie, who was still clutching his sleeve. "Come on, kid," he said softly, his voice gentle. "Let's get you somewhere safe." Sophie nodded, and for the first time that night, her shoulders relaxed just a little. Keanu felt Sophie tense at her father's words. He turned slightly, looking down at her with an encouraging expression. "Sophie," he said gently, "why don't you tell us what really happened? It's okay to speak up." Victor started to protest, but Keanu raised a hand, silencing him with a quiet authority that left no room for argument. "Mr. Langham, I believe Sophie is old enough to speak for herself." Sophie hesitated, her breath shaky. But then, with a sudden burst of courage, she spoke. "It wasn't from playing," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, but growing stronger with every word. "Dad hits me. He hits Mom too. He does it all the time." The words sliced through the air like a knife. Victor's face twisted with rage. "She's lying. This is ridiculous," he sputtered, his carefully crafted facade cracking under the weight of the moment. But Sophie wasn't finished. "Before the event, he hit me because I didn't want to wear the denim jacket," she said, blinking back tears. "It's rough and it hurts my wounds. When I move, the fabric scratches my skin. But Dad made me wear it anyway. He said it makes me look stylish and hides all the bruises." A hush fell over the room. Keanu felt his jaw tighten, his fists clenching at his sides. "He hit me too," Sophie continued, voice trembling, "when I kept asking for Mom earlier." Victor's entire body tensed. His face, once carefully controlled, was now red with fury. He turned sharply toward Sophie, eyes blazing. "She's just a child," he snapped. "She doesn't know what she's saying. Stop embarrassing me." Then, before anyone could react, Victor grabbed Sophie's arm, his grip brutal, causing her to whimper in pain. The moment he did, Keanu moved. Faster than anyone could register, he stepped in between them, catching Victor's wrist mid-swing. His grip was firm, unyielding, his voice quiet but filled with a power that left no room for argument. "You've done enough." Victor struggled against Keanu's grip, but the difference in strength was undeniable. Keanu didn't even flinch. "I've heard people say you have a bad temper," Keanu said, his voice like steel. "But this isn't just a temper. This is abuse." Victor's eyes burned with fury, but before he could spew another threat, Keanu turned toward the security guards who had been frozen in shock. "Shut down the event. Now." His voice was calm, but it carried the full weight of authority. "And someone call 911. For a moment, the guards hesitated, glancing at each other, uncertain. Victor Langham was a powerful man, a man with connections. But then Keanu spoke again, his voice cutting through any doubt. "Did you not hear me?" he said, his gaze locking onto them. "This man has been abusing his wife and child. Shut it down. Now." One of the guards snapped into action, speaking urgently into his radio. Another pulled out a phone to call the authorities. The gala, the spectacle, the carefully orchestrated PR event, it was all crumbling before Victor's eyes. Panic flickered across his face. "You can't do this," he hissed. "Do you have any idea who I am?" Keanu didn't even blink. Victor's voice dropped into a venomous whisper. "I'll ruin you, Reeves. You'll never work in this town again." Keanu met his gaze with quiet defiance. "You're done, Victor. Not me." The distant sound of sirens cut through the night air. Victor's confidence wavered, his panic deepening. Security had surrounded him now, preventing any chance of escape. As the first officers arrived, Keanu stepped back, keeping Sophie close. One of the officers, a seasoned detective, took in the scene with sharp eyes. "What's going on here?" Keanu's voice was steady as he spoke. "This man has been physically abusing his wife and daughter. I stopped him from hitting Sophie just minutes ago." He gestured toward Sophie's arms. "And these bruises? They're not from playing." The detective's jaw tightened as he turned to his team. "I want a full sweep of this building. Find Mrs. Langham. And get Child Protective Services here, now." Victor's bravado crumbled as the officers stepped toward him. He stumbled back, his earlier threats turning into desperate protests. "This is all a misunderstanding," he blurted out. "It's just family discipline. You know how kids exaggerate things." The officers weren't listening. Handcuffs clicked into place around his wrists. As they led him away, he locked eyes with Keanu one last time, his face a mask of fury and desperation. "You'll regret this," he slurred, his voice venomous. "I have friends in high places. You're finished." Keanu didn't even spare him a response. Instead, he looked down at Sophie, who was still holding onto him, her small fingers gripping his sleeve. "You're safe now," he said softly. Sophie swallowed hard, nodding, her eyes filled with something fragile but unbroken. Then, from across the room, a voice rang out. "Mom." Sophie turned, her entire body going stiff. Keanu followed her gaze to see a nervous-looking staff member leading the woman into the room. Barbara Langham. She looked stunned, her expensive gown pristine, but her expression a mix of confusion and fear. "Is it time for the photo shoot?" she asked uncertainly. But before anyone could answer, Sophie broke free from Keanu's side and ran straight to her. "Mom," she sobbed, throwing her arms around her mother. Barbara's eyes widened, the reality of the situation crashing down on her in an instant. "Sophie," she whispered. Then, looking up at the officers, at Keanu, at the man in cuffs, realization dawned. Her face crumpled. Oh, God. Tears filled her eyes as she clutched her daughter tightly. I'm so sorry, she whispered. I'm so sorry. The detective stepped forward, voice firm yet compassionate. Mrs. Langham, we'll need to take your statement. We'll also need both you and Sophie to be checked out at the hospital. Barbara nodded, holding Sophie close. Whatever you need, she said, her voice trembling. Then, with more certainty, I want to press charges. The officer nodded, motioning for his team to escort them. Barbara turned to Keanu, her expression filled with gratitude and pain. Mr. Reeves. Keanu. I don't know how to thank you. Keanu shook his head. You don't need to. Just focus on getting better. You and Sophie deserve a new start. Sophie looked up at him, hesitant. Are you coming with us, Mr. Reeves? Keanu crouched down, smiling softly. Not this time, Keto. But I'll check in on you soon. I promise. Sophie nodded, a small, hopeful smile forming. You promise? Keanu met her gaze. I promise. As Barbara and Sophie were led to safety, Keanu remained standing in the hotel entrance, watching them disappear into the night. The air was cool, the chaos of the evening finally settling. Behind him, he knew his publicist, his manager, the entire world would be waiting with questions. But in that moment, none of it mattered. Because tonight, he hadn't played a hero on screen. He'd been one in real life.